Everyone, I'm Divya. I'm a part of the Nivan core team, and today I am joined by Brenda Luo, healthcare innovation strategist and occupational therapist who's spent over a decade at the intersection of clinical care and inclusive design. We're talking responsible AI in healthcare today, the promise, the gaps, and what it actually takes to get it right. So thank you so much for joining me today, Brenda.
Thank you, Divya. The pleasure is all mine.
Okay, let's jump right in then. So, you sit at this really interesting intersection of clinical practice and innovation strategy. How did that path come together for you, and when did AI start entering the picture?
I love these questions. That's actually like a two-parter.
Yeah.
But a couple, maybe a couple of things to clarify before I sort of get into like my journey a little bit. So clinical practice specifically typically refers to direct patient-facing care, and also, innovation as a term is just pretty vague and kind of means different things to different people. So, I am going to restructure your question a little bit to bring actually more visibility to occupational therapy, which is
Yeah.
actually not all clinical. And I think when we think about occupational therapy, or some people have some understanding of occupational therapy, there is maybe an assumption that it's all clinical, but it really isn't. It's a very, very diverse field. I have a lot of colleagues, and I'm fortunate to know a lot of colleagues that do lots of non-traditional work and exist in OT and sort of intersectional spaces.
Mhm.
And to just kind of give a little summary of what OT is, it's just honestly a really cool field focused on how humans do. And you can think about the word occupation from occupied, which is what humans do. And with the term innovation, I typically use that in service design contexts as a
Mhm.
descriptor for cross functional or interdisciplinary. And this is kind of with the intention of usually trying to deliberately cultivate diversity of thought to hopefully solve a problem, which is what I tend to enjoy and coach, and which is why I sit on a board for an org that does hackathons and am involved in hackathons. So, yeah, that's it's in terms of interdisciplinary and cross functional. I don't think you can get any more innovative than that.
Mhm. Yes.
So just going back to my journey, in terms of how I sort of got into what I do, I've been interested in UX and design thinking actually since grad school when I was studying occupational therapy, and my thesis at the time was actually on the usability of mobile health apps for older adults. And
Mm.
now that I've kind of had more experience with clinical practice in multiple settings, and I've also now had the privilege to explore UX, service design, and product. One of the things that sort of did come up is a lot of fear with change. We've all kind of collectively gone through COVID, which is very traumatic for a lot of orgs and industries, and this is especially the case in healthcare. I would say there's a lot of parallels in terms of how we're managing, thinking about COVID as well as, the looming AI situation.
Yeah.
And that's also creating a lot of fear as well. So to me, I really just sort of see this as a service design problem and a way for our systems to, not be a hospital that lets a central line infection happen. And to give you a little bit more context on that metaphor, it really is from healthcare. So if we have two hospitals, one hospital accepts that central line infections are normal, and central line infections just happen. The second hospital gets curious, pulls data, sees that hand hygiene is a predictor of central line infections, is able to be agile, curious, and implement policy, and that actually prevents central line infections from happening. So I obviously promote adopting the approach of the second hospital. And my question to orgs is usually, how can we ensure that you are in a place where you can be curious, agile, and resilient to learn and evolve with new change? And this is something that myself and a couple of my colleagues within UX, service design, innovation, like all of us, I think, are trying to support orgs and governments with some of these things. So, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
it's a very hopefully a helpful metaphor to think about things.
No, no, that was helpful. And I really I appreciate that. You can either be like Hospital One and just like stay stuck in like the ways, be like, this is just how it is. It is what it is. But the second one is it's like, okay, like let's approach this with curiosity. Let's like figure out why is this happening? Is this preventable? Probably. It clearly is because of hand hygiene. So like now we can actually make the problem go away, and that's the whole point. And I really like the way that you just encapsulated that in that metaphor.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so my next question is when you first started seeing AI tools show up in healthcare contexts, what was your gut reaction? And since then, has that evolved?
So certainly, with anything new, I think there's bound to be a little bit of uncertainty. Obviously, with
Right.
my background in mental health, I take more of like a regulation first approach, and some of it is okay. Let's learn about this a little bit before kind of passing judgment, and take more of like a balanced approach. I think it's
Hmm.
totally fair to be concerned and or fearful. I think of change because there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of unknowns. And in terms of just thinking about things that are actually deployed and examples from other industries, like we can actually learn from that. And so there's a lot of ways that we can evaluate and think about AI. So in terms of my approach, I certainly try not to kind of get swept up in the hype because I also had colleagues that were really into AI and very, very excited about it. And I also, especially on the clinical side, had colleagues that were really concerned about like what this means. And within healthcare, like what has kind of been coming out and already sort of exists and is a little bit more embedded within infrastructure, I would say, is scribes, schedulers, and I would say decision support tools in some ways as well. And in thinking about those things and evaluating some of those different solutions, a lot of the concern actually comes up around regulation and patient information, right? So things like how are we ensuring that we're collecting or how are we ensuring that whatever the data the tool is using is actually the most minimal amount of data possible to preserve and to uphold, I think, regulations around patient information, right? And that's also similar in terms of thinking about, okay, like, do patients actually have access and understand the way that their information is being used, right? And that's kind of more of like a data sovereignty perspective. And then also if something happens to the system, like are patients actually notified, right? And so a lot of it is kind of how is the information being used and what are we using it for? And those kinds of considerations, I think, are very much in line with thinking about risk and thinking about, and I think having also good data policy within orgs as well. And there's a healthy amount of skepticism that comes with that, but also these are reasonable questions to ask because these are also questions that I think support in terms of orgs building out data policy and building, guidelines and guardrails and or frameworks actually to support how to utilize tools and also tools that utilize data. So because of these kinds of different processes, a lot of kind of what I think about when approaching AI tools and approaching I would say even like AI enabled workflows is, who is aware of the information that is being collected, disseminated? Are they aware of where it's going? Are they aware of what it means? Are they aware of like how this data is kind of being collated, right? Certain data has kind of different value, I would say, and are people also aware of like the value that their data has? So these are kind of very trauma-informed principles that are embedded within some of these questions. And these are also the same questions that if you have, I think, a good policy, like these questions end up being addressed. So I think I don't necessarily want to do too much fear mongering, but I think when we are thinking about adopting AI tools, a lot of it is around, how can we adopt this responsibly and ethically and in a way that is going to respect people's information. And an example of like where I would say tools kind of maybe went a little bit too fast, or tools kind of are a little bit too, or we're not necessarily intentional about the consequences. Is obviously in mental health where I think there was like a very public example of chatbots being used for mental health, and certainly in an unregulated way and having very unfortunate consequences. So that definitely illustrates some questions about human in the loop processes when humans are actually compromised. So, in terms of just general sentiments and kind of sentiments about AI in general, like I would say I would say balanced in terms of understanding some of the risks and understanding some of the concerns about AI, but on the flip side, I also do really love computer vision. Computer vision, I think, has a lot of really great applications in rehab. And computer vision, I think, can really support with functional independence, I think. So I certainly kind of understand both the pros and cons and very much recognize that AI is a tool. And that's also what I promote in terms of when I speak to other people about it as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I I completely agree with what you're saying. I think that it's a difficult line to kind of be straddling, right? Like on one hand, it's just like, okay, there's a lot of very private data being used here. How transparent are we being with the users about how where their data is going? Because do we even know where their data is going? I feel like a lot of times with these models, like they're just being fed so many data sets and like there's so many fast processes going on that I'm not even sure if like the people who are deploying these systems are completely aware of the consequences and of the effects of these systems and like how these models are continuing to be trained on such vast amounts of data. And so especially in like a healthcare context when these models can be used to again help with like diagnoses, decision support like that. And you mentioned something. It's like how do you feed them just like the right amount of data so that it's not too much? But then the other question I have when you say that is just like, okay, but what if some of the data that we are omitting is necessary, like for like a completely accurate diagnosis? But again, like, but how do you do that in like a transparent, ethical, um, just correct way, responsible way?
It's a very good question, and there's a lot to wrangle with there, right? And that's, I think, why I'm probably always going to be a proponent of human in the loop processes or human
Right.
on the loop processes, right? At the end of the day, like, like clinicians, I would say, especially kind of in healthcare, are trained with some of these difficult decisions sometimes, right?
Hmm.
There is a little bit more infrastructure, I think, to support with like liability. And I
Hmm.
think even in terms of regulation, like that is changing in terms of like who is actually liable when something goes wrong if a clinician uses a tool and something goes wrong,
Right.
right? And I think like at least in Canada, the regulations are kind of pointing towards it's actually shared liability.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's shared liability in terms of, like yes, it is, and also shared within like the tool too, right? In
Hmm.
terms of like who built what and who is gathering what information, and yeah, so there's
Who
different pieces.
prompted?
Yes, yes,
Like
yes.
there's yeah, there's a lot of again, like you said, pieces to this. You can't just go after one person because it's not just one person slash thing.
Yeah.
Oh,
Into AI policy and data stuff and data sovereignty especially I think is super interesting, and
hmm.
certainly, and this is like maybe a slightly different perspective because like I am in Canada. A lot of like we in Canada we don't even have independent, I would say, or sovereign data storage in a lot of ways because the data that in terms of data solutions that we have for storage, like these are still American companies. Yeah. Yeah. So there
Mm.
is some discussion, I would say, around, sovereign AI and data sovereignty, right? Because
Hmm.
again, in terms of Canada being its own country, right? Like, are we like is this information that we want to retain, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Other
Okay.
countries are actually already exploring sovereign AI and data sovereignty
Yeah.
and have much more, I would say, are much further along in terms of regulations, laws to support with that. Yeah.
Hmm. Wait, so does that mean that the data that's fed in from Canada as well as being like factored into how the model functions overall? Or like, is that
I
correct?
so typically when I talk about data sovereignty, it's about like data storage and like
Okay,
where does data actually go? I think when it is processed,
I see.
when it is used for whatever reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these solutions, I would say, are again, there's only like there's I would say there's a handful of companies that are very big and do a lot of I would say have are known for solutions within data storage, right? And these companies are
Mm-hmm.
American. Yeah.
I see.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting. And have you seen like any like movement in this area, like in Canada specifically? Like, are you guys actively exploring data sovereign
It's
platforms?
this is actually I would say like it's a really good policy ask. There are certainly conversations that are happening, and I do have colleagues at McGill that already sort of work in data sovereignty, and
Uh-huh.
like these are some like proposed policies that are I would say maybe incoming or like these are things that certainly people have interest in, and these are things that people are talking about because again like after what Canada experienced with COVID in terms of supply chain stuff, right? There's a little bit of interest, I think, in thinking about supply chain from a more independent kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
How can we kind of ensure that manufacturing and our industries, I think, are sustainable within our own country, right?
Yeah.
And like data sovereignty is a part of that conversation as well.
Interest.
Yeah.
Okay. Ah, that makes sense. So it's like a whole big thing. Like, okay, how do we make sure that we as a country are self-sustainable without needing to rely on American companies
Or
for
it's
literal
I think
data
it's also
storage?
like, do we have options, right?
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. No, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, a bit of an aside, but yeah, like it's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh, like when you're talking to people from different countries, it's like, oh yeah, think about like every country has their own laws, their own legislation, I think, around data, around privacy. Like I know in like the US, it's the big thing is HIPAA, right?
Right.
Like even I think in Alberta, it's a little bit different too because it's the Health Information Act,
Mm,
it's the PIPA, right? And so
mm.
these regulations are different and have different levels, I would say, of like yeah, there are different terms basically to these regulations, and it
Yeah,
is helpful to sort of be aware of them, especially kind of if you're
right.
dealing within the space.
And because these data storage facilities are American companies, the data that's within them operates off of American legislation, so it doesn't necessarily factor in the
Yeah, yeah.
Canadian
And so
policy.
sometimes you have to, sometimes in terms of utilizing these solutions, you then also have to ensure that it is compliant with local legislation as well. And that can also be challenging, I think, for organizations as well. Yeah.
Mm. Okay. Okay, I want to look more into this.
Yeah.
This is very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump into the third
Sure.
question.
Yeah.
So, in clinical settings, there's already a deeply embedded culture of do no harm. Do you think that ethos translates well into how AI is being designed and deployed in health? We kind of touched on this, but I want to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, no, totally. So I think that ethos is very much alive and well for clinicians and medical professionals. I wouldn't say that it's always the first thought on the
Mm,
design or on the builder side, especially kind of
mhm,
depending on what metrics and priorities are being pushed.
mhm.
I do also have the pleasure and privilege of having kind of colleagues that I would consider more of like the builders within the space, and they are actually quite intentional around understanding some of like the risks and some of the I would say, liability concerns in terms of
Hmm.
what happens when systems actually do harm, right?
Hmm.
And managing risk that way. So I think it is very much a consideration, but I don't think it's always a consideration. And with AI specifically, with the pace of new models, developments, and releases, and just honestly how fast things are, advancing. Certainly, I don't always think that things are being tested before deployment. ChatGPT Health, I think, is a really great example of this. There's actually I've touched on this a little bit, but there is some actual harm in misdiagnosing. And you mentioned this and brought this up too. Like there is actual harm
Hmm.
in misdiagnosing
Hmm.
people. There's actually a really great video done by Dr. Rohin Francis on YouTube, so Midlife Crisis,
Hmm.
are on actually the risks and harms of misdiagnosis and how that kind of can cause sometimes trauma and anxiety. And it can be
Hmm.
unnecessary in a lot of ways because health is a very personal thing for people.
Hmm.
The other part of the do no harm that I don't think is intentionally ignored but and exists is actually related to the paternalism and I would say the traditional medical model that exists in healthcare where you know we we when we exist within structures that have an aspect of paternalism, a lot of more kind of patient-centered care practices center on informed consent and transparency. But I think even within some like certain existing workflows, these are not necessarily always prioritized either. And so again, in terms of ensuring that patients have information, do patients actually know what is going to be done with the information that is being collected?
Hmm.
Do they know that it is a possibility potentially that their data will be used for training or packaging or like some other purpose, right? And also, do they have access to their data, not necessarily just in like the original form, but also in its modified forms and its packaged forms and it like, in the forms that it is being used for whatever purpose, right? So there's, I think, some of that legislation and and this is kind of where I think orgs having policy is actually really supportive because these are questions that may or may not come up, right? And having processes or a bit of an understanding of what to do if these questions do come up is actually really helpful because it's again it's defining what information is. It's defining who has the right to what information. It's defining who
Hmm.
sort of has ownership. Is it shared ownership, right? So
Hmm.
with a lot of these different pieces in terms of doing harm, like harm is on a spectrum.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And I think in terms of getting ahead of thinking about harm, a lot of it is how do we ensure that we are responsible and ethical in the way that we handle information? And by
Right.
thinking kind of responsibly and ethically, right, it is, oh, these are some of the questions that come up. Do we actually have processes, policy, standards? Do we have an idea of like what we want to do if someone is asking about their information, if someone is asking these questions, right? Or for
Hmm.
whatever reason, someone might need access to this information, right? Do we know what to do,
Hmm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and these are all things that should be figured out before it's deployed. But like what we're seeing is that it's just going out there,
Yeah.
and then we're seeing some really, really crazy consequences and negative consequences emerging from that. And like again, that goes back to the whole statement that you made. Like the models aren't fully being tested. They're not being tested properly in order to mitigate these kinds of results. Like we don't want to see that. That's not what we want in the slightest. And I feel like having those standards and those policies and those questions being answered beforehand puts us in a much better place, where we can like save our own, you know behind as
Yeah.
well.
I do
you
I do
know
want to clarify that like I think there is so testing is kind of an interesting word to use here because within training AI models, actually quite a bit of testing is done, but it's not
right.
functional testing in the sense that it's not
Right.
always being tested for real world deployment. And it is
Exactly.
you typically, oh, we're going, it is, oh, we have kind of tested this in a certain kind of environment and it seems like it works, right? But are we thinking about human workflows in terms of real world deployment? I'm
Hmm.
actually doing a talk
Oh.
at a conference for developers, I think, somewhat soon here, and I don't know when this podcast will be released, but
Hmm.
yeah, I am doing another talk specifically for developers on how do we kind of design systems for stressed users or stressed systems. And
Hmm.
a lot of this is, how do we consider deployment within systems that are stressed, that where people aren't necessarily always having the capacity to think about liability or risk, or are very, very
Right.
concerned about liability and risk, but then the considerations kind of are around how do we ensure that systems and or tools and or solutions are designed to support the people that exist within these kind of contexts and support them with
Right.
their everyday workflows. Yeah.
Right. And like that kind of goes into the second part that I wanted to talk about was that healthcare workers, they put their all out on the line. We know that they're overworked. We know the system doesn't always, at least in America, the system doesn't, the system typically fails them,
It's
you know,
it's
like the
it's
healthcare system.
similar. It's similar all over
It's
the
it's
world.
similar
Yeah.
all over the world. Healthcare workers are stressed. They're going through a tough time, and so when they're offered this, like, okay, this model can help you, can make your life easier, can help you diagnose, like they're also human, right? It's about that human
Yes.
experience. If they're too tired, if they're too stressed and they want like a little bit of help, they might look to the model and then something catastrophic could happen afterwards. But like that does how do we ensure that they are protected if that occurs, you know, that we've thought about all of the possible outcomes and how to ensure that we're doing no harm not only to the patient but also to the healthcare professional that's going to be penalized, you know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting like thing to work in, you know. It's an interesting system to work in. It's you have to think about the users who are the patients, but you also have to very much think about the other set of users who are also the practitioners.
Yeah. And you ask a really great question in terms of, yes, like definitely healthcare workers are, overworked, are doing a lot. I think with regards to the clinical work, I would say that the demands of clinical work have also increased in some ways, right?
Right.
I in terms of for well, I think we will talk about this in a little bit, but I am a
Mm-hmm.
big proponent of, for clinicians specifically, actually building clinical reasoning skills and building up that clinical judgment and building those critical thinking skills, right, before diving into leveraging AI to support workflows, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also will tell new grads and students that, again, like you'll get better results from leveraging AI if you actually have an understanding of how it can help you within your workflows, and it'll also establishing some of those skills in terms of clinical reasoning, critical thinking, clinical judgment,
Right.
right? You'll be better able actually to evaluate AI output as well, right? Such that you're
Exactly.
not you're not just there's no cognitive backsliding happening where you're relying on AI to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
for you. At the end of the day, that's still kind of being processed by you, and you are still very much the human in the loop, or the human
Yes.
providing oversight in the human on the loop kind of process.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Right.
So it's at the
Yeah.
end of the day, like it's at the end of the day still like AI is a tool. It is not meant to be, it cannot it cannot function, it does not function well as a replacement, right?
No. No.
And human, in terms of human decisions, human judgment, right? Time and time again, I think it we know with the ChatGPT for Health example that a lot of misdiagnosing can happen there, and I think when there were models trained, right? Depending on the information that is provided, right, a lot of misdiagnosing can happen. There can be ways to make models more accurate that way, right? But also it's also in terms of understanding AI and where we are in the path and journey to AGI, that we know that AI is not very great at pulling in information from like diverse sources, basically, right? And it's also not in terms of if you sort of understand where AI is getting information from, right? It's not always from edge cases or populations or demographics that are traditionally underrepresented in data either, right?
Right.
And so understanding some of those pieces, there this is kind of where it still is helpful to have knowledge, to have specializations, to have to do your own research, I think, with regards to some of those particular special cases.
Hmm.
Yeah, and you can still, I mean, you can still kind of utilize AI to like support you, but understanding the limits of AI is also super helpful.
Yeah, AI can't account for nuance, and like in order to
Yes.
prevent that, like you need to be able to identify what's missing, and you need to have a working skill set in order to be able to identify it. Yeah. Okay. Chronic pain, neurodiversity,
Yes.
trauma-informed care are areas where patient experience is highly individualized and often misunderstood. What are the risks of AI making assumptions in these spaces?
Yeah. So we did touch on this a little bit in
Yeah,
terms of, misdiagnosing, creating some harm, inducing trauma,
right.
potentially also like, making symptoms worse in terms of people not knowing what is actually going on. And
Yeah.
obviously, like, really, really unfortunate things in terms of people, like, losing their lives, right? And so there are obviously these really crazy sort of risks and really in terms of harm that is possible, right? Really, really quite catastrophic. And so we know that these things are possible because they already have happened, right? Even
Yeah.
in terms of if we think about like technology and just the short period of time, I'm going to say short relative, right? Because if we're
Yeah.
thinking about just technology generally and all the types of technology, like it has actually
Right.
caused quite a bit of harm. So I'm actually maybe going to shift the conversation a little bit in terms of moving away from the perils to like, okay, what is actually something that like we can do about it, right?
Yeah.
We know because in terms of what is quite catastrophic, we have already seen it happen, right?
Right.
That would actually be taking that inclusive innovation approach to data, right? It's taking a trauma informed approach to research and data gathering and, taking a trauma informed approach and inclusive innovation approach also within kind of design practices as well, right? This is both how we build solutions, how we train models, how we gather data, how whose data is included, how we ask for consent in terms of data, right? And also, I think for people who have lived experience and exist within some of those demographics where data is traditionally underrepresented, that,
Hmm.
hey, like this is like maybe an opportunity to support you in terms of becoming AI literate because tools sort of exist maybe for you to build as well, right? There is a little bit of democratization that is happening with regards to AI tools existing, right? And that there is kind of an opportunity there, I think, to build local solutions, right? Build custom solutions, build solutions that are particularly niched for particular demographics, right? This is also co design, participating in hackathons, getting involved with builds, right? And also, you know, maybe thinking about when do we want to use local models versus aggregate models and thinking critically about when to use what and what makes sense and really thinking intentionally around okay what yes we have access to AI, it is one tool, but is there actually more than one tool within AI that we can use and what is actually going to be more appropriate and more supportive, right? And so it
Hmm.
is maybe more of like a workflow question in terms of like at the end of the day, AI as a tool, right? Is it's not necessarily just one AI model. It can be multiple, right? What
Hmm.
makes the most sense for this particular case? What are we trying to do with it, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really like the idea of local models. My follow-up question to that is like normally in the data sets that are underrepresented, it is typically those of marginalized communities, maybe communities who have less access to resources. So,
Yeah.
in the case where they might not have the same level of like digital literacy and like access to technological resources, how can they effectively implement local models that could then be used to factor into the aggregate models?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I was go and I was going to talk about AI literacy a little bit more too,
Hmm.
because it's something that I'm currently really interested in and working towards
Hmm.
as well, especially because literacy varies so much across people and even in terms of clinicians too, like literacy, like AI literacy, tech literacy, very, very diverse in terms of what people are both aware of, comfortable using, how they feel about things as well, right?
Hmm.
And really, here's like, I think kind of from a low level, maybe like a universal sort of perspective I can give is that, hey, like this is again something that we can approach with some curiosity. We can approach with, hey, like
Hmm.
what can we actually learn here, and kind
Yeah.
of start building in terms of steps towards, okay, how can we help others and ourselves be more literate, and that how can that also be a experience that
Yeah.
promotes health and creates joy, right? I think in terms of you're right, like for marginalized communities, there is a lot of disparity with regards to literacy. And a lot of that is also understanding that, like, hey, like some of this data actually has value as well. And a lot of that is again, because that data does have value, how can we think about where that data makes sense to leverage, or where that data
Hmm.
makes sense to kind of include, right? Again,
Hmm.
if we're kind of taking more of like a population health or a longitudinal health approach to this, like are there cost savings to certain demographics and their data being included, right? Because
Hmm.
this is your stuff that is basically like your increased quality of life over like the next 20 years, right? Or if a particular demographic is a little bit more susceptible to like cardiovascular disease, right? Is that
Hmm.
data actually supportive in terms of building solutions and or models that can support with
Hmm.
either like predictive analytics or preventative health approaches, right?
Hmm.
Honestly, utilizing data in this way is not new
Yeah.
because this is what exists. Like these are practices that are already sort of existing within public health policy, right?
Hmm.
It's just that like now with AI, we actually have more access to information in some ways, but we also have more access to tools that can process information faster. And so, because we have access to tools that can process information, right, it is actually just more of like the data gathering and identifying where to gather data and who to gather data from that is maybe like
Hmm.
more of the part of the process that we're maybe wanting to be a little bit more intentional about in terms of inclusion, right?
You've spent years in inclusive design and DEI work. Where do you see AI perpetuating the same inequities it promises to solve, especially in care contexts?
So we already know that it's perpetuating inequities. A very prolific writer in the space, Karen Howe, she's the author of Empire of AI. She's done a lot of qualitative work actually on some of the first-hand accounts of labor displacement and how the model of labor to train AI models is actually quite traumatic and creates really unhealthy family dynamics, actually. And again, like rather than sort of fearmonger, because a lot of that information you can sort of get from Karen Howe's book, some of her interviews as well. And with that, I'm quite in agreement with her perspective here, where she's also advocating for ensuring that humans are actually making decisions about AI, not necessarily just at the level of, hey, like you're utilizing AI kind of in your daily workflows or in your life, but also making decisions about AI from a systems level or a slightly broader context, right? So in addition to thinking about like what are the controls, what are the constraints, what are the limits, it's, you know, how do I want to be involved in terms of these models that are coming out, right? Rather than being the one to support the training, doesn't make sense for me to be the one that is building solutions, right? And that's kind of a slightly different approach. There's also a recent story about embodied AI actually creating a traumatic experience for an elderly woman in China, which is actually quite funny. And China's also a space where AI is a little bit more accepted. So I think there's also an opportunity here for learning with co-design and AI literacy, where if we kind of think about, some workflows that are maybe a little bit more preventative, right? Potentially older adults are going to be a little bit less traumatized with, more of a communal approach to like AI literacy, or more of a compassionate approach to AI literacy. And the engineers behind building that embodied AI robot, if they actually learned about macular degeneration from maybe doing some testing or deployment focused testing with older adults, maybe they would have learned about macular degeneration, which is something that happens as you age. You kind of maybe lose some of your periphery in terms of your vision, right? And a control for a robot like that is maybe announcing its presence, and that being a little bit less traumatizing, and that implementation being a little bit more supportive for, the demographic of older adults.
That is such an interesting story. I thought when you said like traumatizing, it was gonna be oh my God. Then she just showed up in her peripheral vision and she couldn't see.
But it is a legitimate response, right?
No, it
Because if something
really
is
is. Yeah.
literally in your peripheral like in your peripheral vision, you don't know what it is, right?
No,
It's a scary
exactly.
experience. If it's at
Yeah.
night, it's a very scary experience.
It's terrifying. I would be terrified if I turned my head and I saw this robot. What does human-centered AI actually mean to you in practice? Because it gets thrown around a lot.
It does get thrown around a lot. And I think like a lot of people would kind of be like, oh yeah, it's built, designed for, by, and with. And I think like it's in terms of what that functionally means, to me, it really is like co-design and that collaborative building process, right? If we think about like hackathons, right? If we think about, you know, user experience research, right? If we think about testing, right, it really is these processes where, co-design really happens. There's also opportunity, I think, again, in terms of, you know, providing literacy, right? So I also want to offer a little bit more of like a human activity or occupation oriented perspective, because this is like my background, right? In terms of thinking about how is a human going to use it, or how is a human going to
Hmm.
remember to use it, or how is a human even going to like enjoy using it at different ability
Hmm.
levels, at different movement levels, at different cognitive levels, right?
Hmm.
Like thinking about the diversity of humans and how humans like to do things, how is it going to be implemented in their workflows, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes thinking that way is really helpful in terms of narrowing down your user group, but can also tell you about like what some of those critical points for testing are for deployment,
Hmm.
because you're also just thinking about like the context of how someone is going to be utilizing a tool, solution, piece of tech, whatever, right?
Hmm.
Like one of the things that I will probably talk about with my later talk to developers too is thinking about it when you're building for those stressed environments, right? Yes, you might be thinking about testing in like ideal situations, but a clinician, for instance, you know, in an ED is going to utilize the tool potentially in a different way compared to like a clinician in like a pediatrics environment, right? A
Right.
clinician with ADHD might be also utilizing something a little bit differently than a clinician who, is, hyper focused or is on lunch, right? Like it's understanding some of the contexts that
Mm-hmm.
your users might have. And you don't quite get that information without doing user interviews, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it like you can also get some of that information in testing and deploying in a couple of different environments before you sort of do like a formal deployment as well.
Mm-hmm.
But for human-centered design and human-centered AI, it really is just understanding that humans are not always calm and capable and like have full access to their working memory and capacity. It's also humans, existing at different functional levels in different contexts in actual life, real life, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of accounting for some of that within testing, co-design, the collaborative process, building, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's throughout and having those touch points as well, which I think is also just a very relationship driven process as well.
Yeah, because treating your users as co-creators is how you're going to build the most successful design. And like, if you're building just for one ideal user who fits like the normative standard with like fully functional capabilities, no mental disorders happening whatsoever, no stresses around them whatsoever, like then that is going to look very different from someone who's existing within so many different contexts. And we as humans are not able to be put into just one box. So if you're going to try to create something that is truly universal, you need to be iterating constantly. You need to be seeking feedback constantly from the people who are using the product and like in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of UX people, I think, naturally are oriented towards empathy and perspective taking. I
Right.
think that can be a little bit harder for devs sometimes, right? Because
Right.
it's, oh yeah, like I think this is a process that I can do, therefore my assumption is that users are going to be able to do this, right? Tech
Right.
literacy, lots of diversity there,
Right. Right.
right? But also
Right.
just thinking about like where you like even just I think thinking about yes, even you like I might be able to do something at this particular moment, but planning like thinking about your bad days or planning for your bad days, right? Like if you're sick, are you still
Right.
going to be able to like do those same processes? Are you still going to be able to
Right.
navigate those workflows, right? And that kind of exercise can be supportive in terms of really stress testing a solution too. It's like it
Mm-hmm.
like it really is thinking about, oh, okay, how can I create this in a way such that, it is going to be usable for people within varying situations, right? On a bad
Mm-hmm.
day, with a headache, right?
Yeah.
With a crying dog or a
Yeah,
kid, right?
exactly. How are we going to account for the humanness of life in our solution? Oh, I love it.
I love it.
Okay. In your consulting work, when organizations come to you wanting to add AI to their workflows, what's the first question you ask them?
So I actually ask a couple of questions, but the very first question that I would start with is, can we take a look at the workflow that you're trying to put AI into together?
Hmm.
Just because it's again like if it's a workflow question, let's look at the workflow, let's evaluate it, let's pull it apart, let's think about the different pieces, right? The other question that I ask is also, what do you know about AI and why do you think it will help? Because again, that's getting at what is your current understanding? Where is your literacy level of AI at? Right. And getting a bit of an understanding of like what do you think AI is going to accomplish for you here, and
Hmm.
what is like your goalpost, or what is your goal in terms of what you are hoping that this workflow will be?
Hmm.
And in terms of thinking about, how robust the workflow is the workflow working well? Are there challenges with the workflow, right? Certainly there are different ways that AI can support with that, but also we want to be thinking about, does it make sense to change, alter, or modify the workflow? Is it a workflow that already works well, right?
Hmm.
Is it worth the cost of doing some of this change management to support with adopting this new tool, solution, whatever, right? What
Hmm.
other tools resources, solutions, or services have you tried? Because sometimes the answer, or sometimes what is most supportive, is not always AI either, right?
Hmm.
Um, and again, like there's other costs incurred, I think, once you consider adopting AI to that might not you might not be considerate of in terms of, once you build an AI solution, who is going to maintain it, right? Is
Right.
it the most simple or productive use of a tool, right? No, it's not just like, does AI make sense? But okay, if you are wanting AI for this particular workflow, right? You know, what else, there sometimes other things kind of can come up with the implementation, right? And is this something that
Hmm.
you were prepared for in terms of cost, or prepared for in terms of your operational capacity, right?
Hmm.
The other kind of questions that I will ask too are around, what is your capacity for change management or digital transformation? And you know, does it make sense for us to kind of do some literacy support in terms of where people are at in terms of their understanding of AI? And, you know, do they have an understanding of what AI can do to support them in terms of their workflows, right? A lot of this is just getting a bit of a baseline in terms of where people are at with the workflows. Like, is this something that everyone actually uses, right? And also, what is your understanding of AI? And also, what is your capacity to take on potentially a a change that is going to affect everyone's workflow, right? So there's a lot of different kind of pieces to looking at. Okay, yeah, we want to adopt AI, but like, what might that mean for you, right? Yeah.
Right. Like, what does that actually look like instead of just like throwing it around like, oh, everyone's
Yeah.
using AI
And
now,
that's
so we need to incorporate it.
implementation.
Yes, exactly. It's just like just because everyone is using it doesn't mean that one, it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And two, like, do you actually need it? Like, is this going to make your life truly easier, or is it actually just gonna make your organization seem less trustworthy, make your employees suffer, make your users suffer? Like, are you is that what you want? Is that the outcome you're looking for?
Which, like, if
So,
you're seeking, I think, like, opportunities to support with building curiosity or innovation, or
right,
like growth, I think, within your team, there's also like a multitude of ways to do that too, right? A lot of
right,
it is also understanding, like, hey, if we are going to deploy and or try this within this kind of environment, like, what is the actual likelihood of success, right?
yeah,
It's not supportive to try to deploy something that, maybe is like, there are going to be server changes within like the next couple of months, and that's going to throw a kink into operations, right? And so
right.
some of those pieces also you want to be considerate of as well, not necessarily just, okay, yeah, this is a new thing, we're sort of interested in trying it out, right? It's,
Yeah,
do you have the resources to do so? Does it make sense? And
yeah,
are your people actually interested in it too, right? Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's a great point. Employee well-being is a big part of your work. How do you counsel organizations on AI adoption when workers are genuinely anxious about being replaced, especially in care contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. There's again, I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier around some of the fear and uncertainty that exists within.
Right,
It's not just in like the care industry or like the health industry, right? It's in very many industries where there's a lot of
right.
fear and uncertainty. I do maybe want to provide some reassurance in the sense that I think there is maybe a little bit of an assumption in that AI is actually intelligent enough to replace human, like, all roles and responsibilities
Right.
of jobs and roles. We don't have AGI yet, and we also know that layoffs due to AI is actually more of a gap in transparency than anything. And we also see that there are shifts in demands for labor for more judgment oriented work because AI is not great at some of that. It's, again, I mentioned previously that AI doesn't, it like is less good at drawing upon kind of diverse contexts, especially kind of
Hmm.
unprompted, right? And AI is also not great at relationship oriented work because
Right.
it's not great at reading some of that human nuance. And AI is also
Right.
not great at creative work, right? Because especially in creating work that is for human audiences, like humans can tell when things are AI generated and when output is in that uncanny valley, and that erodes trust for a lot of audiences,
Yeah.
right? So there is still very much a lot of priority and a lot of weight, I think, in human oriented work.
Right.
And this
Right.
is kind of where, like, yes, of course, like roles will change. It's also, I think, natural and human for you know us to grow and evolve, and for orgs that are interested in AI with human oriented values specifically, and who kind of have values and missions that align sort of more with human oriented or human centered type thinking.
Hmm.
Reallocating and retraining employees, especially kind of in AI maintenance, adoption, and compliance, also means that you'll have the system, the infrastructure, and processes to ensure that whatever AI solution you're going to adopt is actually going to be sustainable and like work for you too, right? This is what I was mentioning a little bit earlier in terms of those considerations. Like, are your people, you know, like who is going to maintain the system, right? Who is going to fix it when it goes wrong, when something goes wrong, right? And these are like ultimately, I think, opportunities for people to upskill and learn, right? One thing that I have sort of noticed within the industry kind of at large is that orgs are a little bit less likely to train and upskill employees, even though a lot of the literature in workplace wellness and in employment sort of demonstrates that training and upskilling actually increases employee retention, productivity, and organizational resiliency. And I do also want to put it out there that like a really awesome example of this is IKEA, where they obviously have been adopting AI within their processes. And the specific kind of example here is that they've been utilizing more AI within drafting tools. And so that has kind of replaced some of the workflows for people that were doing the drafting previously. And they actually upskilled their staff to have more creative oriented work within their roles, which is actually, again, like in the literature, we know that the more creative oriented work is more satisfying. And having, I think, their staff having new roles as designers and creating more novel combinations actually, made it such that their store displays were more interesting, and really help them lean into that DIY kind of hobbyist community that they have existing and can leverage that market, right? So I think that like IKEA is a really awesome example of, how you can reallocate company resources, which are people, to support marketing, to support adoption of AI in ways that kind of can still result in really, really impactful and really, I would kind of call it lovely, unexpected things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's an example of where like the business was happy, the employees were happy, and the users ended up being well, customers were happier too because the store displays were better. Like it can be a win-win situation when used appropriately and within the right context.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's like their employees being, like in terms of their workflows being changed by AI, right?
mhm.
Employees themselves also leveraging use of AI tools to support
Right.
themselves in terms of their career as well. So that is also like that AI literacy ask
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. For care staff specifically, actually, like I would kind of recommend sort of like a similar approach, right? Like, again, we do have data literature demonstrating that patients really, really value high quality, high touch human experiences. Again, with that
Hmm.
example with the elderly lady in China, right? Like, we just do not have the trust in robots and embodied AI to be able to perform some of these like health adjacent healthcare tasks, right?
Right.
And we also don't have like the regulations, governance, compliance, data, right, to even I think support some of this being implemented. So like especially in care environments, I would say like we're a little bit further away. But that's
Hmm.
also where, again, like the AI literacy piece, there's opportunity for new roles. This is where clinical expertise with a healthy and skeptical interest in AI is helpful. Health systems are complicated, and we need people that are familiar with navigating complex systems to support with
Hmm.
these processes, right? And
Right.
I think with clinicians specifically, like a lot of clinicians are following colleges and regulations from colleges, right? And so there is already a little bit of an understanding of what responsible and ethical use of things can look like, right?
Hmm.
And so I think again, this is where like that course that I'm creating is helpful, right? In terms of how do we think about building in literacy? How do we do literacy in a way that is inclusive? And how do we also support ourselves in terms of seeking and finding opportunities within
Hmm.
the changing landscape of AI? Yeah.
Right. Because we're not powerless, we
Yes.
can
Yes.
do things to better equip ourselves. And I feel like with all the fear mongering happening, it's so easy to fall into the mindset of like, oh, okay, I guess I can't do anything about it. But no, there's so much you can do about it. And part of that is, like you mentioned, increasing your AI
Yeah.
literacy.
Yeah.
Like again, equipping yourself with the skill set that they're clearly looking for in this changing landscape.
Yeah, and to kind of bring it full circle a little bit, right? Like that with the fear, right? Like this is also something that we know it, like if you are experiencing fear, like it doesn't support you, right? But also I
Right.
think it creates a lot of capacity for empathy in terms of builds that are considerate of others and are considerate
Right.
of diversity, right? So that's also something I think that in terms of understanding, yes, like this is something we are concerned about, and this is something that is potentially something that has a lot of risks we are afraid of, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That helps us to be a little bit more intentional with our designs. And that also helps us in terms of thinking about how to build for certain demographics as well. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So that kind of segues into my last question, which is what gives you hope right now specifically? Because a lot of AI ethics conversations end in doom and fear and scary things. So where are you personally finding optimism?
So I think that there's a lot of movement in in like sort of the responsible and ethical AI kind of areas and space. There's, I would say, global, national, and sort of local conversations happening within this space as well. I've mentioned a little bit earlier that the space also intersects with kind of like the data sovereignty space, the solar punk space, as well as also like the free and open source software space. And so there's a lot of, I think, really great conversations happening, and people I think are growing in awareness around what this can kind of look like. I always kind of tell people to think critically about new information, and it's thinking of, thinking about new information and evaluating it is really actually supportive for identity development. But it's also really helpful for thinking about how you can utilize that information for yourself as well. And also, evaluating information supports you in terms of detecting information that maybe isn't accurate or is misinformation, right? And knowing that AI is a tool to support collating and gathering information also means that it's a tool to leverage bringing information to policymakers, representatives, right? And that also helps us all collectively as communities, chambers of commerce, consortiums, right, to be able to have autonomy and have choice, I think, within what we see coming out, right? So the conversations that I'm having with partners and collaborators are really great and sort of kind of within this kind of theme. And I also think that people really appreciate having nuanced conversations about responsible and ethical AI, inclusive innovation, and human centered design like this one. So I'm happy to be able to contribute to some of the discussion.
Absolutely. And this was a fantastic discussion. I learned so much. You brought such valuable perspectives to the table, and I feel like I know that our listeners will probably walk away with the same kinds of takeaways. So, on that note, thank you so much for being a part of the mini podcast. I really, really appreciated your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Of course.